There is a specific kind of silence that happens right before a person's life changes forever, and it's a silence I've sat in more times than I can count. It's the heavy, weighted stillness of a backstage dressing room where the air feels like it's being sucked out of the room by the sheer gravity of the pain inside. I was sitting there, nursing a cold cup of coffee, looking at the monitors, and watching a young man named Marcus. He was 19 years old, sitting on the edge of a sofa in dressing room 4, his hands tucked tightly under his thighs, rocking just a fraction of an inch back and forth. To the casual observer, he looked like a kid who was just nervous about being on national television. But I've spent 40 years looking past the surface, and what I saw was a young man who was exhausted, not just tired from a lack of sleep, but soul tired. He looked like he was fighting a war that nobody else could see, and the tragedy of it was that the people who were supposed to be his generals, his protectors, were the ones leading the charge against him. I've seen a lot of things in my career. I've dealt with the most manipulative predators, the most broken families, and the most delusional individuals you could imagine. But there is something uniquely heartbreaking about a child, and at 19, he's still a child in the eyes of the world who is being gaslit by his own biology and then further isolated by the people who claim to love him. The central problem here wasn't just that Marcus was hearing voices. It was that he was living in a reality where his own parents had decided that his suffering was a performance. They had labeled him a seeker, an attention grabber, and a malingerer. They had convinced themselves that he was using these auditory hallucinations as a get-out-of-jail-free card to avoid the pressures of adulthood, to stay in his room playing video games, and to keep from having to hold down a job. When you label someone like that, you stop looking for the truth and you start looking for evidence to support your bias. And that's a dangerous place to be when you're dealing with a mind that is fracturing. When I first walked into that room to meet Marcus, I didn't start with questions about his symptoms. I didn't ask him what the voices were saying or how often they came. I just sat down across from him and looked him in the eye. You can tell a lot about a person's mental state by the way they hold their gaze. Marcus couldn't hold mine for more than a second. His eyes were darting to the corners of the room, tracking something I couldn't see. He looked terrified. I told him, Marcus, I'm not here to judge you, and I'm sure as hell not here to tell you that you're lying. I want to know what it's like to be you right now. He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in the middle of all that darkness. It was a look that said, please, someone finally hear me, because for 5 years, he had been screaming into a void, and the only response he got was his mother telling him to stop being dramatic and his father telling him to man up. The backstory of this family was a textbook example of how a lack of mental health literacy can turn a household into a war zone. Marcus was a normal kid growing up. He played baseball, he had friends, he did okay in school, but around the age of 14, the wheels started to come off. It started small. He'd think he heard his mother calling his name when she wasn't. He'd hear a muffled conversation in the next room when the house was empty. He told his parents, and at first, they laughed it off. They thought he was being imaginative or that he was just going through a phase of adolescent anxiety. But as he moved into his mid-teens, those muffled whispers turned into distinct voices. They weren't friendly. They were critical, harsh, and persistent. They told him he was worthless, that his friends were mocking him behind his back, and that his parents secretly wished he had never been born. Instead of seeing this as a medical crisis, his parents, Sarah and David, saw it as a behavioral problem. They were bootstraps people. They believed that if you worked hard enough and had enough character, you could overcome anything. To them, mental illness was a sign of weakness or, worse, a choice. They began a campaign of tough love that was anything but loving. They took away his door, they monitored his internet usage, and they constantly challenged his claim. If Marcus said he was hearing something, his father would shout, "I don't hear a thing, so you don't either. Now get out there and mow the lawn." They were trying to bully a neurological condition into submission. And all it did was drive Marcus deeper into his own head. He started isolating, he stopped eating. He dropped out of his first semester of community college because the voices in the lecture hall were louder than the professor. And every time he pulled back, his parents pushed harder, convinced he was just being lazy. I spent some time talking to Sarah and David before we went out on stage. They were defensive from the jump. They told me they had taken him to doctors, but the doctors didn't find anything. When I dug a little deeper, I realized they had taken him to a pediatrician and a general practitioner, neither of whom were equipped to diagnose complex psychiatric disorders in a 20-minute window, especially when the parents were sitting right there, contradicting everything the boy said. Sarah told me, "Dr. Phil, we've seen him when he thinks we aren't looking. He seems fine. He's on his computer, he's laughing at videos, and then as soon as we ask him to do something, suddenly the voices start, 'It's too convenient.'" She was looking for a reason to be angry because anger is a lot easier to deal with than the terrifying reality that your son might be suffering from a serious brain disorder. It's easier to call your kid a liar than to admit that you are powerless to fix what's happening inside his skull. What they didn't understand is that the human brain is the most complex organ in the universe, and when it starts to misfire, it doesn't follow a schedule that's convenient for your chore list. Marcus wasn't fine when he was on his computer. He was using the digital noise to drown out the internal noise. It was a coping mechanism, not a sign of health. But in that house, there was no room for coping mechanisms. There was only room for compliance. The escalation of this conflict was reaching a breaking point. Marcus had started talking about ending the noise because he couldn't see a way out. He was trapped between a mind that was betraying him and a family that had abandoned him emotionally. They weren't just failing to help him, they were actively making him worse by creating an environment of constant stress and hostility, which, as we know, is like throwing gasoline on a fire when it comes to psychotic symptoms. As I sat there with Marcus, preparing to walk out under the lights, I realized that this wasn't just going to be a show about a kid who hears voices. This was going to be a rescue mission. I had to get this kid to a place of safety, and I had to get these parents to face a truth that they had been running from for half a decade. I looked at Marcus and I said, "I'm going to tell you something right now that you haven't heard in a long time. I believe you. I don't think you're making this up, and I don't think you're crazy. I think you're sick, and I think you're scared, and I think you've been incredibly brave to survive this long without anyone in your corner." He didn't say anything, but a single tear rolled down his face. That was the moment I knew we could do some work. That was the moment the wall started to crack. But I knew the real battle was going to happen out on that stage in front of his parents, where the years of resentment and denial were waiting to be unpacked. I've always said that you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Sarah and David were acknowledging a version of their son that didn't exist. They were fighting a ghost of a lazy teenager while the real Marcus was drowning right in front of them. My job was to pull the plug on that fantasy and force them to look at the reality of their son's neurological state. It wasn't going to be pretty, and it wasn't going to be easy. People don't like being told they've been wrong for 5 years, especially when that error has caused immense suffering to their own flesh and blood. But I wasn't there to make them feel good. I was there to save a 19-year-old boy's life. The walk from the dressing room to the stage is a short one, but for some of these families, it feels like miles. I could feel the tension radiating off Marcus as we navigated the hallway lined with production crew and equipment. He kept his head down, shoulders hunched, almost as if he were trying to occupy as little physical space as possible. It's a defense mechanism I see a lot in trauma victims. They try to disappear so they won't be a target. Behind us, I could hear the sharp click of Sarah's heels and the heavy, rhythmic tread of David. They weren't talking to each other. They were a united front of frustration, armed with their own truth, ready to present their case against their own son. It's a tragic irony that some parents will fight harder to prove their child is a liar than they will to find out why he's hurting. When we stepped out into the studio, the lights were bright and the audience was settled. I took my seat and watched Sarah and David settle into theirs. They sat close together, a barrier of resentment between them and Marcus, who sat alone on the end of the sofa. I've always found that the seating arrangement on my stage tells the story long before anyone opens their mouth. The physical distance between them was a chasm of 5 years of misunderstood pain. I started by looking at Sarah. She was a well-put-together woman, the kind who likely prides herself on having a clean house and a controlled life. And Marcus was the one thing she couldn't control. I asked her to tell me what she saw when she looked at her son. She didn't hesitate. She said, "Dr. Phil, I see a young man who has checked out of life. I see a boy who was bright and capable, who suddenly decided that the world was too hard and found a way to make us the villains." She told me about the episodes, the times Marcus would scream at nothing, the times he would lock himself in the bathroom for hours. But she described them as if they were theatrical performances. She used words like convenient timing and attention-seeking. She even brought a folder, a literal dossier of what she called evidence. It contained printouts of his search history, notes on when he seemed fine, and a timeline of his supposed inconsistencies. This is what happens when fear turns into a toxic form of surveillance. Instead of being his mother, she had become his prosecutor. I looked over at David, who was nodding along. David was a man who worked with his hands, a man who believed in the tangible. If you can't see it, touch it, or fix it with a wrench, it doesn't exist. He told me, "Dr. Phil, I've worked 40 hours a week since I was 16. I've had back pain that would make a grown man cry. But I got up and I went to work." Marcus, he hears a whisper and he can't even take out the trash. It's a lack of character, plain and simple. We didn't raise him to be a quitter. I let them talk. I wanted them to empty their clips. I wanted the audience, and more importantly, Marcus, to see the full scope of the narrative that had been constructed around him. It's a heavy thing to carry the weight of your parents' disappointment. While they were talking, I was watching Marcus. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring at a spot on the floor, his foot tapping a frantic, silent rhythm. Every now and then, his head would jerk slightly to the left, and his eyes would widen. He wasn't listening to his parents, he was listening to the others. I leaned forward and interrupted David. I said, "David, let me ask you something. If Marcus came to you tomorrow and showed you a compound fracture with the bone sticking out of his leg, would you tell him to man up and mow the lawn?" David scoffed and said, "Of course not. That's a physical injury." I replied, "And what if I told you that the wiring in his brain is just as broken as that bone, but because you can't see the marrow, you've decided it's a choice? What if I told you that the brain is a biological organ just like the heart or the lungs, and it can get sick?" Sarah jumped in then, her voice sharp. "But Dr. Phil, he's not always sick. That's the point. We went on a family vacation to the lake last summer, and for 2 days, he was great. He went swimming, he laughed at dinner, and then the minute we talked about him looking for a part-time job when we got back, the voices returned. How is that not a choice?" I looked at her and I didn't hold back. I said, "Sarah, you're describing stress-induced symptom exacerbation and you're calling it lying. Do you know what happens to a person with a fragile neurological balance when they are placed under pressure? The symptoms flare up. It's not a choice. It's a physiological response. When you push him, his brain retreats into its defense mechanisms. That lake house version of Marcus was him trying desperately to hold it together for you, to be the son you wanted so he could have a few hours of peace. And the cost of that effort was so high that he crashed the moment the pressure returned. You're punishing him for the very symptoms of his illness. The escalation phase of this family's life hadn't just been about Marcus's voices. It had been about a total breakdown of the family unit. They had stopped being a family and had become a battleground. Marcus's sister had moved out and refused to come home because of the constant screaming matches. The neighbors had called the police more than once during what Marcus called the loud nights. In their quest to be right, Sarah and David were burning their house down. I asked Marcus to describe one of those nights. He took a shaky breath, his voice barely a whisper. He said, "It's like being in a room with 10 people who all hate you and they're all screaming different things at the same time. One tells me to hurt myself. One tells me my dad is going to kick me out. One just makes this high-pitched ringing sound that never stops. And then my parents start pounding on the door, yelling at me to stop it. I can't stop it. I don't have a remote control for my brain. I just want it to be quiet. I just want to sleep." The room went silent. For a second, you could hear a pin drop. That was the first time Marcus had spoken with that kind of raw, unfiltered honesty in front of them without being shut down. I looked at David. I could see the wheels turning. He wanted to argue. He wanted to find a hole in Marcus's story. But the look of pure, unadulterated exhaustion on his son's face was harder to ignore than a folder full of evidence. I decided it was time to bring in the clinical perspective. I had Marcus undergo a series of neurological and psychological evaluations before the show, and I had the results right there. I told the parents, I didn't just take Marcus's word for it. I'm a man of science. We did a SPECT scan of his brain. We looked at the blood flow and the activity patterns, and what we saw was a brain that is literally on fire in the auditory cortex. When Marcus says he hears voices, his brain is processing sound that isn't there, but to his neurons, it is as real as my voice is to you right now. He isn't choosing this any more than a person chooses to have an epileptic seizure. Sarah's face went pale. She looked at the monitor as I showed the scans, the bright spots of overactivity that shouldn't have been there. It's one thing to argue with your son, it's another thing to argue with a medical image. I said, "You've been calling him a liar for 5 years. You've been denying him the medical treatment he needs because you were too proud to admit your son wasn't perfect or normal. You've traded his health for your own sense of control. How does that feel now, looking at the physical proof of his suffering?" This was the turning point. The confrontation wasn't just about the diagnosis. It was about the accountability. We were moving into the deep water now. I had to break their denial completely, or Marcus was going to walk out of that studio and right back into the lion's den. I had to make them understand that their tough love was actually a form of psychological torture for someone in Marcus's condition. The silence that followed the reveal of those brain scans wasn't a peaceful one. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a bomb goes off. I watched Sarah. Her hand went to her mouth, and her eyes stayed fixed on the screen where the bright, angry patches of neural activity were pulsing in her son's auditory cortex. It was the first time in 5 years that she couldn't look away from the truth. David, on the other hand, was staring at his boots. His jaw was working, grinding side to side. He looked like a man who had just been told the foundation of his house was made of sand. I let it sit for a minute. In therapy, silence is a tool. And right then, I wanted them to feel the weight of every liar, every lazy, and every get up and man up they had ever hurled at that boy. I turned back to Marcus. He was looking at the scans too, but with a different expression. It wasn't shock for him, it was a strange, haunting validation. For the first time, he was seeing his invisible monster made visible. I asked him, Marcus, what are you thinking right now, looking at that? He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the monitor and said, it's not me, it's just there. It's like a parasite. I thought I was making it up too sometimes. Because they said it so much, I started to wonder if I was just broken in a different way, if I was just a bad person. Seeing the red, it makes me feel like I'm not just a failure. That broke the dam for Sarah. She started to sob, not a quiet, polite cry, but a ragged, ugly sound of a mother realizing she had been the primary source of her child's secondary trauma. I leaned in toward her. I said, Sarah, I'm going to be very direct with you. You've spent 5 years building a case against your son. You've been a detective looking for clues of his deception instead of a mother looking for the source of his pain. Why? Why was it so much easier for you to believe he was a sociopathic liar than to believe he was a sick young man who needed his mother? She couldn't answer at first. She just kept shaking her head. Finally, she choked out, because if he's sick, Dr. Phil, then I can't fix it. If he's just being difficult, I can discipline him, I can guide him, I can control that. But this is forever. I didn't want him to have a broken life. I wanted him to be the boy who played baseball and went to college. I thought if I just didn't acknowledge the voices, they would eventually go away. I thought I was helping him stay grounded in reality. I told her, you weren't keeping him grounded. You were leaving him out in the middle of a storm without an umbrella and telling him he wasn't allowed to get wet. You weren't protecting his future, you were destroying his present. By denying his reality, you forced him to fight 2 wars, one against the voices and one against the people who were supposed to be his sanctuary. And David, let's talk about you. You're a bootstraps guy. You think life is about grit and determination? But let me ask you, if a man is blind, do you tell him to just squint harder? David looked up, his eyes glassy. He said, I just wanted him to be strong. The world is a hard place, doctor. Phil, I didn't want him to be a victim. I didn't want him to spend his life on a couch, drugged up and staring at the wall. I replied, David, he's already a victim. He's a victim of a biological lottery he didn't ask to enter. And the irony is, by refusing to get him medical help because you feared he'd be drugged up, you've left him in a state where he's practically catatonic from sheer mental exhaustion anyway. You wanted him to be strong? He's been stronger than you'll ever know. He's been carrying a burden that would have broken most men twice his age, and he did it while his own father was calling him a quitter. That's grit, David. That's a level of toughness you haven't even begun to appreciate. This was the confrontation phase in its purest form. It wasn't just about the diagnosis anymore. It was about the fundamental betrayal of the parent-child bond. I had to get them to see that their behavior wasn't just strict, it was abusive in the context of Marcus's condition. I brought up a specific incident from Marcus's intake forms. Marcus, I said, tell your father about the night in the garage. Marcus flinched. He didn't want to go there, but I needed it out in the open. He cleared his throat. I was hearing things real bad. They were telling me the car was going to explode. I was trying to get the keys away from my dad because I didn't want him to get hurt. I was screaming at him not to go in there. And he pinned me against the wall. He told me if I didn't shut up and stop the crazy act, he was going to give me something real to scream about. He called me a freak and told me I was embarrassing the family. I remember looking at him and thinking, he'd rather I died in a car fire than have the neighbors see me having an episode. David looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I didn't mean that, Marcus, he whispered. I was so frustrated. I didn't know what to do, but I didn't let him off the hook. I said, "No, David, you did mean it in that moment. You were more concerned with your ego and your normalcy than you were with your son's terror. You chose your pride over his safety. And Marcus, you've been carrying that freak label around like a lead weight. You've started to believe it, haven't you?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I don't feel like a person anymore. I feel like a problem that needs to be solved, or a mistake that my parents can't return. I just want to be gone. Not even dead, really. Just not here. Not a freak anymore." The weight of that statement hung over the stage like a shroud. This is the outcome we were looking at if things didn't change immediately. We weren't talking about a kid who needed a tutor or a summer job. We were talking about a young man on the edge of a permanent, tragic decision because he felt like a burden to the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. I had to shift the energy. I had to move from the autopsy of their failures to the blueprint for his survival. I told them, here is the reality. Marcus likely has a form of early onset schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. It's a serious diagnosis, yes, but it is not a death sentence. With the right medication, with specialized therapy, and with a support system that actually supports, he can live a meaningful, productive life. But that support system part, that means the house as it exists right now has to be demolished. The tough love is over. The evidence folders go in the shredder. The man up talk is banned. If you two can't do that, if you can't commit to being his allies instead of his wardens, then you are no longer part of his recovery. I looked at Sarah and David. I needed to see if they were capable of the pivot. Sarah was nodding frantically, her face wet with tears. David was quieter, but he finally reached out and put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. It was the first time I'd seen him touch his son since they sat down. Marcus didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. The trust was gone. It had been burned away over 5 years of gaslighting and hostility. You don't get that back with one apology or one hand on a shoulder. You get it back with 1,000 small acts of belief. I turned to the audience and then back to the family. I said, we are going to get Marcus into a residential treatment facility that specializes in first episode psychosis. He's going to have a team of doctors who don't think he's a liar. He's going to learn how to manage the voices, and he's going to be in a place where he doesn't have to defend his own existence every single day. And for you two, Sarah and David, you're going into intensive family therapy. You have to learn how to be parents to the son you actually have, not the one you wish you had. But I wasn't finished. I knew that Marcus was the one who had been wronged, but I also knew that for his recovery to stick, he had to find his own voice, not the ones in his head, but his own actual power. I looked him in the eye and said, Marcus, this is the first day of the rest of your life. For 5 years, you've been a passenger in a car driven by an illness and directed by people who didn't have a map. Today, we're putting you in the driver's seat. It's going to be a long road, and it's going to be hard work, but you are not a freak, and you are not a liar. You're a survivor. Do you hear me? After the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the real work began. People often think that once the big moment happens on stage, the story is over. But in my experience, the stage is just the starting block. We moved back into the quiet of the green room area. The air there felt different, less charged with the public performance of anger and more heavy with the private weight of regret. Sarah was sitting on a small armchair, her face blotchy and her makeup ruined, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the span of an hour. David was standing by the window, staring out at the parking lot, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. And Marcus was sitting at a small table, staring at a bottle of water like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. He looked like a man who had just been pardoned from a crime he didn't commit, but he didn't know how to live as a free man yet. I walked over to Marcus first. I've learned that when you break a cycle of gaslighting, the victim is often in a state of shock. For 5 years, he had been told that his internal reality was a lie. Now that the world had finally acknowledged his truth, he was experiencing a kind of emotional vertigo. I put a hand on the table near him and said, "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" He looked up at me, and the darting movement of his eyes had slowed down just a little. He said, "Dr. Phil, I keep waiting for the voices to start telling me that you're lying too, that this is all part of some trick. They're really quiet right now. It's weird." I explained to him that what he was experiencing was a temporary drop in his allostatic load, the wear and tear on the body and brain caused by chronic stress. For the first time in years, he wasn't in a defensive crouch. He wasn't bracing for his father's shout or his mother's side eye. His nervous system had finally received a signal of safety, and in that window of safety, the symptoms often recede, if only for a moment. But I also had to be honest with him. I told him, "Marcus, the voices will come back. They're part of a biological process that we haven't medicated yet. But the difference is, from this moment on, you don't have to fight them alone. You have a team now." I turned my attention to Sarah and David. They were watching us, looking like two people who had just realized they'd been driving in the wrong direction for 1,000 miles. Sarah stood up, her voice trembling. She said, "Dr. Phil, I want to go to him. I want to tell him I'm sorry, but I'm scared. I'm scared that if I touch him, he'll think I'm just trying to fix him again." I told her, "You should be scared. You've spent half a decade being his primary source of doubt. You can't just erase that with a hug and a sorry. You have to earn your way back into his trust, and that starts with listening more than you talk." This is a concept I call expressive emotion, or EE. In families with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorders, high levels of criticism, hostility, and over-involvement, the very things Sarah and David were doing, are the strongest predictors of relapse. They weren't just mean parents, they were a biological trigger for his psychosis. I had to make them understand that their brand of parenting was literally toxic to their son's brain chemistry. I sat them both down and spoke to them with a bluntness that I reserve for the most critical situations. I said, "You two have been acting like his brain is a choice. You've been treating a medical emergency like a behavioral defiance. If you want to be in this boy's life, you have to undergo a complete identity shift. You are no longer the authorities on his reality. You are the students of his condition." David looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the tough guy facade completely vanish. He said, "I've spent my whole life thinking that if you just work harder, you can beat anything. I thought I was teaching him how to be a man. I thought I was protecting him from a world that doesn't care about excuses. I didn't realize I was the one making the world harder for him. How do I fix this?" I told him, "You start by admitting that you don't have the answers. You start by looking at your son and seeing a warrior instead of a weakling. Because, David, most men wouldn't last a week hearing what he hears and still trying to wake up and face the day." We spent the next hour mapping out the transition. I don't believe in just giving people a referral and sending them on their way. I believe in a warm handoff. We had already coordinated with a top-tier residential facility that specialized in first episode psychosis. This isn't your grandfather's psychiatric ward. It's a place designed for young people, focusing on coordinated specialty care. They don't just put them on a high dose of Thorazine and leave them in a day room. They use low-dose modern antipsychotics combined with cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, CBT family, education, and vocational support. I explained to Marcus that he wasn't going to a hospital to be locked away. He was going to a training center for his brain. He'd be around other kids who heard voices, other kids who felt the same glitch in the matrix that he did. The relief on his face when I told him he wouldn't be the only one there was palpable. Isolation is the oxygen that psychosis breathes. When you're the only person in your world who can hear the others, you start to believe you're fundamentally broken. When you see that it's just a pattern, a medical phenomenon shared by others, the shame starts to dissipate. And shame is a heavy weight to carry when you're already struggling to stay upright. But the real challenge was going to be the aftercare for the parents. I've seen this happen 100 times. A kid goes away to treatment, gets stabilized, finds his footing, and then comes back to the same toxic environment that triggered the break in the first place. It's like cleaning a bird's feathers and then throwing it back into an oil slick. I told Sarah and David, if Marcus goes to this facility and does the work, but you two don't change your household, you are setting him up for a catastrophic failure. You have to learn a new language. You have to learn how to validate his feelings without necessarily agreeing with his hallucinations. You have to learn how to provide a low-stress environment where his brain can actually heal. I watched Sarah take a notebook out of her purse. She started writing things down. It was a small gesture, but it was a significant one. It was the first time she was acting as a student rather than a judge. She asked, "What do we tell our friends? What do we tell the family?" We've told everyone he was just being difficult. I looked her square in the eye and said, "You tell them the truth. You tell them that you were wrong and that your son is fighting a brave battle against a serious illness. You stop protecting your reputation and start protecting your son." If people judge you for having a son with a mental illness, then those aren't people you need in your life. You've been choosing appearances over substance for far too long. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. We had reached the end of our time in the studio, but the journey for Marcus was just beginning. I saw him stand up, and for the first time, his posture was different. He wasn't hunched. He wasn't hiding. He looked at his parents, and then he looked at me. He didn't say thank you, and I didn't need him to. The look of being seen was enough. We walked him out to the car that would take him to the facility. As he got in, David reached out and shook his hand, then pulled him into a brief, awkward, but genuine embrace. It was a start, a small, fragile start. I stood there on the sidewalk, watching the tail lights of the car fade into the distance. I've done this for a long time, and I've learned that you can't save everyone. Some people are too invested in their own delusions to ever accept the truth. But every now and then, you see a crack in the armor. You see a moment where the truth becomes more powerful than the lie. Marcus had a long road ahead of him: medication adjustments, therapy, the slow process of rebuilding his self-esteem, but for the first time in 19 years, he was walking that road in the light of day. He wasn't a freak in the shadows anymore. He was a patient in recovery. And in my book, that's a hell of a lot better than being a liar in a house of cards. About 6 months had passed since that day on the stage, and I decided to check in on Marcus at the residential center. I've learned that the true measure of success isn't what happens under the bright lights of a television studio. It's what happens in the quiet, mundane moments of a Tuesday afternoon when no one is watching. When I pulled up to the facility, I didn't see the hunched, fearful boy I'd met in dressing room 4. I saw a young man sitting on a park bench, sketching in a notebook. His movements were deliberate, his focus was sharp, and for the first time, his eyes weren't darting to the corners of his vision. He was present. He was in the here and now. We sat together for a while, just talking. He told me that the voices hadn't completely vanished. That's rarely how it works with a condition like his, but they had become background noise. With the right medication and the cognitive tools he'd been practicing, he could recognize them for what they were: a biological glitch, not a personal truth. He said, "Doctor, Phil, it's like living near a busy highway. The cars are still passing by, but I finally learned how to close the window. I'm not standing in the middle of traffic anymore." That's a powerful metaphor for a 19-year-old who had spent 5 years being run over by his own mind. But the most significant change wasn't just in Marcus, it was in the ecosystem around him. Sarah and David had been doing the heavy lifting in their own therapy. It wasn't easy for them. David told me during a phone call that admitting he was wrong was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He'd spent his whole life equating wrong with weak. I told him, "David, admitting you're wrong isn't weakness, it's the highest form of character. It's putting your son's life above your own ego." And he did it. He stopped being a prosecutor and started being a protector. He learned that his job wasn't to fix Marcus's brain, but to provide a safe harbor where Marcus could do the work of fixing it himself. There was a specific moment about 3 months into his treatment that tested everything. Marcus had a bad day, a breakthrough episode where the voices became loud and aggressive again. In the past, this would have triggered a blowout fight. Sarah would have accused him of slipping back into old habits, and David would have yelled at him to get a grip. But this time, they followed the plan. Sarah sat with him in silence. She didn't challenge the voices, she just validated his distress. She said, "I know it's loud right now, Marcus, and I know it's scary. I'm right here and you're safe." David didn't demand he mow the lawn. He brought him a glass of water and stayed in the room until the storm passed. That's what belief looks like in action. It's not just a word, it's a posture of empathy. As I prepared to leave the facility that day, Marcus handed me a drawing from his notebook. It was a sketch of a lighthouse standing in the middle of a violent sea. He told me, "For a long time, I thought I was the wave. I thought I was the thing that was destroying everything. But now I realize I'm the lighthouse. The waves are just the illness. They hit me, but they don't define me." I looked at that drawing and I saw a young man who had found his footing on solid ground. He was talking about going back to school, maybe studying graphic design. He was making plans for a future that 6 months ago he didn't think he'd live to see. The reality of mental health is that it isn't a destination you reach and then stay at forever. It's a management process. Marcus will likely have to manage his symptoms for the rest of his life. He'll have to be diligent about his health, his stress levels, and his support system. But he's no longer a victim of a story he didn't write. He's the author now. And his parents, they aren't the villains of his story anymore. They're the supporting cast he deserves. They learned the hardest lesson a parent can learn: that you can't love a child for who you want them to be. You have to love them for exactly who they are, glitches and all. I walked back to my car feeling a sense of quiet resolution. This is why I do what I do. It's not for the ratings or the headline. It's for the Marcuses of the world, the people who are screaming for help in a world that has its fingers in its ears. We live in a society that is quick to judge and slow to understand, especially when it comes to the invisible battles of the mind. But when we choose to listen, when we choose to truly see the person behind the symptoms, we create the possibility for a miracle. Marcus wasn't a liar, he wasn't lazy, and he certainly wasn't a freak. He was a 19-year-old boy who just needed someone to believe him. And once he had that, he found the strength to believe in himself. That is the power of the truth, and that is the only way the healing ever truly begins.